Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our Dysgraphia Life webinar. If you have not been to our webpage, it's www.dysgraphia.life. We have a lot of resources on that page, including the recordings of our past webinars from this Dysgraphia webinar series, as well as things like one of the most recent items is a handout for teachers. If your child may have writing difficulties and you're trying to explain that to a new teacher who may not be familiar with dysgraphia. I also want to highlight that one of our new initiatives is promoting dysgraphia research, because there's really not enough research out there about specific learning disabilities of written expression. So we are running a fundraiser now through the end of October, which is Learning Disabilities Awareness Month. Any amount of support is greatly appreciated, and we would love for you to check out the fundraiser and share it with friends and family who may understand how important it is that we get more funding and more capability for dysgraphia research. So we are really excited tonight to have Dr. Bonnie Singer with us. She is fabulous, and I'm so excited to hear her talk because she is the rare combination of someone who has a background in education, in clinical work, and in research, all at the same time. And she brings lots of different hats to the work that she's doing. She focuses a lot on writing. She was actually recommended by one of our prior speakers, Dr. Pfeiffer. And after having a conversation with her about doing all of this, I'm thrilled to hear the talk. I will put the link in the chat at the moment. But what we do have copies of her slides if you want to look at the slide and take notes as she's talking. In addition, the webinar will be recorded. We have gotten that question from a lot of people. It will be recorded and made available and emailed to everyone who registered tonight within a week of tonight's live recording. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Singer. She's the founder and CEO of Architects for Learning. She's also the CEO of Vito. She's going to tell you a little bit about how she got into this space. And here's her talk. It's called Writing: What to Do When Students Struggle. So with that, Dr. Singer, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. And I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, all of you, invisible people out there, for taking an hour out of your precious life to come talk about something that's so near and dear to my heart. So why is my slide not advancing? So really, my first question is, why am I here? My background, I'm a speech and language pathologist by training, and my doctoral studies focused on writing and written expression. So I actually went into doctoral world with an interest in reading, and partway through got super fascinated by kids who struggle with writing. So my clinical background, I run a clinic in the just outside Boston, Massachusetts, called Architects for Learning, and have since the mid-1990s. We work with kids who are from anywhere from kindergarten all the way through graduating from college, who have challenges with language, with literacy, with some aspect of learning, and virtually all of them have some difficulty with written expression. I also spend a lot of time working with teachers and training teachers, and have developed some methodologies for teaching writing, various aspects of teaching writing and reading comprehension, and things that are hard about language and literacy. And so my work with teachers in professional development is done under my second company, Vivito. So I love talking about this topic. I was just saying to Jennifer, please interrupt me, because I could be here for many, many hours and sharing with you. I hope that tonight where we're going is just a little bit of what we know about writing and the nature of various kinds of writing challenges and the diagnoses that are used to capture those challenges. I'll share a little bit of what it takes to write and some of the research and work that I've done, and leave you with some thoughts about what's essential for instruction based on my 35 years of clinical practice in working with kids who struggle in this realm. So strap in. here we go. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So if something occurs to you, please don't hang on to it or think you're going to remember it. Just shoot it into the chat for Jennifer. She'll collect everything. We'll have some time at the end, and I'll be able to address some of what's niggling in the back of your brain. I want to start by sharing a little perspective from the National Commission on Writing. This is older research from 2004. But what happened is they pulled a bunch of Fortune 500 CEOs together. And we're really looking at what is the role of writing beyond, beyond high school into the professional realm. And these Fortune 500 CEOs categorized writing as a threshold skill for employment and for promotion as a requirement, really, for both. They talked about it being the ticket in or the ticket out of a professional level job. And more than half of them reported that they frequently or almost always considered an applicant's writing ability when they were hiring salaried leveled employees. So from a longevity standpoint, one of the things I care very deeply about is kids having the literacy, the skills that they need to get out of school and have life beyond school, to find themselves successfully in some kind of job that they can perform well, that they can forge relationships with other people, that they can acquire new information about the world and be a good citizen, that they can vote from an informed perspective, that they're informed people to sit next to on an airplane for 8 hours. I care about the literacy of my neighbors and our community very deeply. So when we look at how important writing is for someone's ability to hold a job, to be able to provide for their family, and their own self-esteem, it's critically important. When Ken Kay and his partners at a group that was dedicated to looking at what kinds of skills and abilities do kids need leaving high school in order to be armed with what they need for life beyond, they interviewed a whole bunch of business owners and around some of their concerns, what they saw kids lacking, and that shaped some of our educational agenda in the early 2000s. What they found is that 81% of these business owners expressed concern about high school students coming into the workforce with deficient writing abilities. It was their number one concern. They also had concerns about leadership and their work ethic and critical thinking abilities, and all of those got baked into some changes in curriculum and how we go about working with high school students and preparing them for life after high school. But it's striking that number, 81% really being concerned about kids not having the writing abilities that they need to be successful. A lot of people struggle with writing. If you were all in a room with me, I'd say, raise your hand if you have ever in your existence found writing to be difficult. And my hand would be the first to go up. Just because writing is difficult for you doesn't mean you have a disability. And knowing where that line is, it turns out we're still doing research and we're still really figuring that out, where that range of typical and expected versus really much more prominent. We can look across the nation and see how we've done in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Our last huge assessment where the writing was done by hand was in 2011. And when we look at the outcomes across our nation, so these are kids from every state in the United States, we see only 3% of kids in 8th grade and 12th grade demonstrating advanced writing ability, a very small percentage. And then 24% demonstrating proficient abilities in writing, and a whopping 50% just being at a basic level, and 19, 20%, 21% being below basic. So 3/4 of our students are leaving high school with basic or below basic writing abilities. And these numbers from the NAEP have not changed dramatically in many, many, many decades. So after 2011, the NAEP went digital. Kids were asked to type on laptops their written responses, or you use tablets to take the test. And when we look at, well, what's going on there and how does that compare to when you ask kids to hold a pencil, they did another widespread assessment, all digital in 2017, and then made some comparisons between our 2011 outcomes. And in 8th grade, kids on laptops versus 2017, when they did tablets, what they found is that kids did better when they were on a laptop with a keyboard than on a tablet. And that 50% of the kids reported never having used a tablet in their English class in school. So yet they're being assessed on some device that's foreign to them. If we looked at the grade 4 outcomes, they're very similar. 2012, kids on tablets, laptops did better than kids on tablets in grade 4. What we see there that resonates with a lot of current and well-structured research is that the amount that kids write is strongly related to their speed and automaticity with actually typing or with handwriting. 47% of the kids, though, in this study reported never having used a tablet in school. So it begs into question, what is the NAEP actually testing? Are we testing writing? Or are we testing technology proficiency? And how do the devices and the interfaces and typing skills influence our writing assessments? That's a huge area of question. So they actually decided to take those, 2017 results and really delve into a lot more research. They're not able to make statements about writing ability because they're not even sure that the classroom experiences align with how kids were being asked to take these tests. So we don't have terrific normative data nationwide on what's typical for kids when it comes to writing. The reality is that some kids, there is a pocket of kids who just struggle so much when it comes to writing. It's a chronic problem. We see it interfering with their academic performance. We see that sitting in a classroom and receiving the same kind of instruction as the kids next to them, they're not responding to that instruction with the same kind of progress and rate of improvement. And for many of them, it alters their willingness to engage with writing, their motivation to write, their emotions about writing, their sense of self-efficacy or seeing themselves as able to write. And you don't have to be very old to figure out this is inordinately difficult for me. So I've worked with little kids, 8 years old, 7 years old, first, second grade, who are like, you can't make me do this. I'll just tell you what I know. I mean, I can demonstrate my knowledge and understanding of this academic content so much more fluidly and with so much more depth if we sit down and have a conversation about it than if you force me to actually try and put this onto a piece of paper. And so there is a group of kids whose difficulties are beyond what we would expect. And then it becomes a question, do they just have a weakness? Do they have a disorder? Do they have some kind of learning difference that just needs to be accommodated a little bit differently? Are they delayed in some aspect of their development? Is there some kind of learning challenge or something, or a problem that instructionally just needs a little bit of something different? And it becomes a big question of, what do we call these kids? And is there a diagnosis that attaches to them? And so this diagnosis, dysgraphia, is actually not even really a diagnosis. It's not a medical diagnosis. but it's a term that lots of people use to describe various kinds of writing problems. And it becomes very muddy depending on who you ask. They're going to define dysgraphia in perhaps a different way. And so I just want to shed a little bit of light on that and some of the diagnostic criteria and the terminology that's used to capture various kinds of writing problems. One question is whether a kid's writing looks like this or somewhat like this. This is clearly a student who is having difficulty forming letters, managing the motor movements, to encode letters on the page. It's if you watch this student, their writing would be slow, it would be arduous, it would be effortful, and it's the legibility is quite poor, spacing is off. There's a lot going on here that has to do with the motor system. So what we call kids who are exhibiting difficulties like this is a little bit different from kids who exhibit different difficulties. But in the International Classification of Diseases, which is basically the world's set of diagnostic terminology that everybody agrees on. So you can be in Italy and have your appendix out, and you can be in Canada and you can be in Kansas. And there is a code that is used internationally to describe certain kinds of disabilities, certain kinds of medical conditions and problems. And so that ICD-10 has been recategorized 10 times. It's just about to be put out with an 11th version of the ICD classifications. But what this kid would classify for as a diagnosis in ICD-10 is a developmental disorder of motor function.
We had a question about how old that child was to produce that writing.
Oh goodness, you're testing my my memory. So remember that I've been doing this for 35 years. So I can't remember the exact age of this kid. I want to say probably somewhere around 2nd or 3rd grade, because that would be typically where I would hang on to something like this. It's a great question. That being said, I've seen 7th graders who write like that and 15-year-olds who write like that. So when that's a really chronic problem and it isn't altered, we're really looking at something that's very entrenched in the motor system. And so the criteria for this diagnosis, developmental disorder of motor function, is the handwriting is irregular, the spacing between the letters and the words and the lines is irregular in size and not well monitored. The gestural development and of, the whole upper extremities and how you actually get writing out of you with your arms and your hands, there's something immature around those gesture systems and that motor system. There's many kids, not all, but some may exhibit a ton of pressure on the pencil. They need a lot of feedback through their hands in order to know where they are and what they're doing. They may sweat, they may feel pain, they may breathe really hard. It's a lot of effort for them to write while they're handwriting. You may sometimes see the tongue wagging out of the mouth while they're handwriting, and motor overflow, and that happens because the tongue is right next to the hand in the part of the brain that controls movement. So sometimes when the hand neurons get excited, the tongue neurons it kind of like bleeds over into the tongue spot, and kids stick their tongue out and waggle it around while they're handwriting. And it's just a suggestion that we've got like an immature neurological system here within those distinctions. And some kids will tremble when they're handwriting and generally it's slow. So speed and automaticity are two major factors of ease of just getting words onto the page. When kids are in 1st grade, that doesn't come quickly or automatically. They're learning, but with practice, you get faster and faster at forming letters. You don't have to think about it every single time. Eventually, you just know how to form an A, and now your cognitive resources can be allocated to other aspects of writing, and handwriting is just kind of smooth and automatic. It's like when you're learning to tie your shoes, you have to think about it a lot, but eventually you can do that. You can have a conversation, you can be on the phone, you can be drinking a cup of coffee. It all happens all at the same time. This becomes very automatic and doesn't require a lot of intentional, conscious control and effort. So sometimes writing looks like that, and sometimes it looks like this, and this doesn't look so bad, right? It's legible, it's fluid, the letters are properly aligned and nicely spaced, and there doesn't seem to be difficulty with output. But when we actually read it, and I'll read it to you because I've read this 10,000 times and it kills me every time. This text is about a favorite historic figure. And it reads, Thurgood Marshall, the Supreme Court judge in 1983, was doing the right thing and put people in jail because they was being bad, doing drugs, and smoking other things than cigarettes. And the other great thing I like is recess, going outside to play, some basketball out in the park, and some days beat my friends, and some days beat me by cheating, but I did not say anything. I just let them beat me. I like lunch because you get to see and talk to them, but the food's disgusting to me, and I'd rather eat lunch from the milk than the chips is okay, but the food is nasty, and I could not take it. It was so nasty to eat. So there's Thurgood Marshall, my favorite historical figure. And what's happening here is this writer is using a very early developmental approach to writing. We see this in kindergarten kids, first graders, early writers approach writing through what's called a knowledge telling approach. They have a thought, they write it down. That makes them think about this, they write that down. And that makes them think this, and they write that down. So it's like one association after the other after another. So if this youngster were in first grade and writing a paper about historical favorite things, and they wrote something about Thurgood Marshall, we'd be thrilled because they're in first grade and they know who Thurgood Marshall is. And look at, they wrote about all these things they like. And that's a lot of text, and it's a big monologue, and that's a huge developmental leap for a first grader. We'd be thrilled. The not so good news is this kid's in sixth grade. And by sixth grade, we don't expect kids to use a knowledge telling approach to writing anymore, because they've had lots of instruction, they've had exposure to academic text, they've had lots of experiences with literacy and learning about how writing works, that we don't expect them to just have a thought, write it down, have another related thought, just write it down. We're expecting them to actually be more thoughtful and to transform the information they have in their head and craft it and shape it into patterns of academic language that look like paragraphs or essays or reports or persuasive letters and these different forms of writing. Nobody learns to do that through the air. They have to be taught. And so this kid, who, by the way, the fact that he didn't capitalize I is not the problem with this text. And neither is the fact that he repeated the word me twice. Like, the problem with this text is it's completely disorganized for a sixth grader, and it's off topic. And he really only got one sentence that's about Thurgood Marshall, which is what he was supposed to be writing about. And then he meandered. And so we're seeing writing break down for this student for very different reasons than this student. And sometimes we see kids who have difficulties in both of these realms. The motor piece is a problem, and so is organization and the composition and all the juggling that has to happen. So for kids whose writing looks like this, the diagnosis that fits is a specific learning disability in written expression. However, we have to look very carefully at the diagnostic criteria for that diagnosis, because when you look at it carefully, it eliminates virtually everybody. So one thing that must be there is that the kid has to be exhibiting these kinds of difficulties for at least 6 months, despite having received help specifically focused on those difficulties. Okay, so they have to be resistant to direct instruction. Also, they have to have academic skills that are substantially below what's expected for their age and that cause problems in school and work or everyday activities. The difficulties that they experience with writing need to be evident during the school age years, even if they don't really experience a significant problem until they're an adult. So the roots of the difficulty are evident when kids are quite young. And sometimes those challenges become insurmountable in the older years when writing demands get really complex. And lastly, this is really important. Difficulties are not due to other conditions such as intellectual disabilities, vision or hearing problems, a neurological condition like a pediatric stroke or a traumatic brain injury or a concussion, or even ADHD would classify as a neurological condition. It's not due to adverse conditions such as economic or environmental disadvantage. It's not, so you can't be poor. That's not the reason, right? And it can't be due to some difficulty speaking or understanding language. So you can't have a language disorder accounting for your written expression problems. And most importantly, it can't be due to a lack of instruction. And so when we look at that criteria and we see kids who are writing like this, the big question is, what are they getting for instruction? What are teachers doing with them? What if they had for instruction? What else is going on with their learning profile? Are there other areas of challenge that are in their way? Do they have trouble learning to talk? Do they have trouble with spatial skills and spatial processing? Do they have difficulty with attention or memory? Are these other systems explaining the difficulty with writing? And I can tell you that vulnerabilities in virtually any other realm of thinking and ability will show up in writing. So this is tricky. The diagnosis issue is very, very tricky. You need to see a skilled diagnostician who has a lot of experience in figuring out the entire profile of a child who is struggling and really get at what else is going on and what explains some of the challenges with writing that we're seeing.
And there's two questions that are really
Yes.
sort of specific to that diagnosis piece that seem like we should maybe ask them
Sure.
now. One is, why is academic skills one of the criteria specifically? And the other is whether you think a lot of kids are misdiagnosed with ADHD instead of being diagnosed with the written expression problems.
So why academic skills are required to be there?
DSM,
yeah, because writing is an academic skill, because it's not separate from academics, and so the academic expression of written ability is required for us to even see it. And the issue of ADHD and disorders of written expression, or LD in written expression, I would say those are very commonly either comorbid problems, like they're happening at the same time. We see an inordinate number of kids who struggle with attention to varying degrees, and whether it's just inattention, but not hyperactivity, or inattention with hyperactivity, it doesn't matter. Part and parcel to those challenges are difficulties with executive functions, which I'm going to define in a minute. And executive functions will always constrain your writing. 100% of the time, executive functions constrain your writing. So what we see is common roots to some of these other diagnoses that get attached to kids that can't help but affect their writing. They also sometimes can't help but affect their talking, because there is so much rapid on the fly planning and organizing that is required to be able to sustain a monologue with someone. And if kids get distracted, we go off topic. And if they can't organize their thinking in order to express something in a logical way, it doesn't come out logical. And that sometimes we see that in their talking and their writing. Sometimes we just see it in their writing because there's a bunch of other stuff that has to happen with writing too. So I'm going to get to that in a second. I hope that helped. If it didn't, we'll come back to it at the end. This is one of my most favorite things that any researcher has ever said about writing. I think it's so genius. Marlene Scardamalia, Carl Berreiter, they wrote a book many years ago. She says to pay conscious attention to handwriting, spelling, punctuation, word choice, syntax, textual conventions, purpose, organization, clarity, rhythm, euphony, and reader characteristics would seemingly overload the information processing capacity of the best intellects. And that is what is happening when we write. We have to do all those things simultaneously. So it's an enormous number of balls that we have to keep in the air. And the way I conceptualize it, just metaphorically for the kids that I struggle with, is that, or that they struggle with writing that I'm working with, is that for some kids, spelling doesn't come easily at all. And so spelling is like an enormous ball that they're juggling because they have to spell in order to write, and it's made out of glass, right? So they can't sustain that plus all this other stuff at the same time. And so sometimes spelling just goes in service of, I need to have an idea. I need to say what Huck Finn was trying to say. Like, so ideas are going to sometimes trump spelling, and sometimes spelling trumps ideas. Sometimes kids are just like, I don't know how to spell that, so I need to not use that word because I'm too scared of getting it wrong. So we see lots of overlays and like fingers in, and the thing I say all the time to people is everything affects everything. Listening affects speaking, listening and speaking affect reading, listening and speaking and reading affect writing, and writing affects all three of those. And those are influenced by and also affect attention and cognition and your emotions and your memory. Everything affects everything. And so one ball being out of whack can really muck up a whole bunch of systems that are otherwise supposed to run synchronously, very seamlessly. And that's very, very hard. So I just want you to just try this on. Okay, so here's a writing assignment. This came from a real kid. Select one of the following lens-based prompts from your final essay on Hamlet. You will use the lens as a way to determine and explore a central message about the text, using key concepts and vocabulary to strengthen your analysis. Your paper should be 5 to 7 pages and follow MLA format. Okay, so think of all the balls that are already on board and you haven't done any writing yet, okay? There's one lens of 5 that kids are given to choose from. Here's the lens, the formalist lens. I have that within which passes show. Quote from the text. Analyze Hamlet's message about appearance and reality. Examine the motif of appearance reality and explain how variations of this idea work together to support the organic unity of the text. Which characters engage in acting, spying, disguise, or lying? What deliberate attempts at deception are at play, and when are they successful? What imagery or other literary elements are associated with this motif? Are you having a panic attack? Because the kid who got this assignment was having a panic attack. Like, this is so big and so multifaceted and so overwhelming, and it requires more than just writing ability. It requires you to have read Hamlet and understood Hamlet, that you understand what a motif is, that you understand what a lens is, that you can pull quotes from the text, that you can find citations and places where Hamlet is doing this, that, and the other thing. And you can demonstrate and pull that all together to express some kind of organic unity concept. That is enormously challenging from a cognitive point of view and a language point of view, even if you don't even think about what your hand has to do, right? There's a lot that has to happen. And if you don't know anything about grammar, you're sunk. And if you are weak in vocabulary, this is also difficult. And if you are distracted, good luck. So when we work with kids, this is a kid I worked with for years. Her name is Jenny. This was in high school. She's writing about Jane Eyre, right? So you can see she can't juggle all the balls. So some of what goes is her handwriting's not that great. It's legible, but she struggled with handwriting when she was younger. And she would describe herself as someone with dysgraphia. She can't really keep the left-hand margin over on the left. And think about Jane Eyre and her favorite character, Mr. Rochester, and all of his character traits, and get that all going. And she has a thought, and then she changes her mind, and it doesn't belong there. And this should really go here, and get rid of that. And I don't like that word. And this is really difficult to do simultaneously. So writing is a juggling act, and you drop a lot of balls. And you have to be able to monitor, which balls did I drop? Are they important for me to pick up and throw back up in the air again? Or can I just leave it on the floor right now and I'll come back to it later? But then I have to remember to come back to it later. And I have to be able to see how fixing that problem is going to go. So it requires planning, it requires organization, it requires attention, it requires memory, it requires motor skill, spelling, and there's just so much going on. So when I was doing my doctoral studies, my advisor gave me the most vomitous assignment ever. I hated this assignment with the depths of my being. And in hindsight, I loved this assignment. And her task was basically read everything there is to read about writing and how it works and come up with a model based on your understanding of the literature of what you think is going on. So this is the culmination of several years of research and reading, which we then pulled together and published in 2004. The citation is at the bottom of it. If you can't read it, I can send it to you. And where this came from is looking at the research on typically developing writers. And then looking at the research at, well, what do we know about typically developing writers? And then what do we know about kids who struggle? And mostly what we know about writing, we've learned from kids who don't do it very well, from the places where we can see, oh, that ball dropped. This writer can't sustain that ball. This is really chronically problematic. And so it's our kids who have struggled who have taught us the most about how it's supposed to go. So in this model, my metaphor is basically writing is a building. You're building something. Some people see writing as painting. They have other metaphors. Mine's it's a construction project, academic writing anyway. And the top part of the house is what's happening inside your head before anything comes out, or in order for things to come out. And the bottom part of the house, the foundational part of the house, is, so in here, is all the stuff that we know from published research that can muck up the top part of the house, okay? So what's happening? You've got to have an idea. You've got to generate something to write about. And in this model, that's like, it's an inkling. It doesn't even have words yet, right? Like I'm planning something to say. And then I've got to generate some language to capture it. And sometimes I don't say it right the first time. So there's some implicit knowledge of language that I'm drawing on, and I might change my mind before the pen even hits the paper or before my keys hit the keyboard, my fingertips hit the keyboard. And so that's really kind of conscious awareness of language and what's proper, what sounds right, what's going to convey what I'm intending accurately. And so we revise on the fly. And along the way, we're organizing. When organizing is sequencing. We're sequencing words, we're sequencing letters to make words, we're sequencing words to make sentences, sentences to make paragraphs, paragraphs to make longer chunks of text. And what's at the heart of all of that is your executive system, your ability to, what your brain does when it gets something done on purpose, right? And there are a bunch of cognitive processes, things that brains do so that we can do things on purpose. And some of them is keeping ourselves regulated and not just pitching a fit because it's really hard. But there's research showing that kids who have very high IQs tend to write better than kids who have very low IQs. Your conceptual ability, your ability to reason, that influences how well you write. What you know about language is going to influence how well you write. How you feel about writing, that's going to influence how you write. We have research on all of this. So for me, diagnostically, this is the model I use. If I'm trying to figure out why a kid can't write, I have to account for all of the things on this model. I've got to understand, and I can't do this as a single person. That's why we have teams. That's why we have teachers and psychologists and OTs and PTs and all these people on board, because each person brings a different lens and expertise to be able to speak to some of the sub skills that are going to go into all that juggling act.
I'm going to jump in to say it's past 7:40, so
oh my goodness,
a little bit over, but there's definitely people saying, so then what can we do? So
yeah, so I'm going to plow through this. This is what kids say, why writing is so hard. Boom, boom, it's really hard. So just a few thoughts to leave you with. One is, if you're one of those kids who really struggles with the graphomotor, right? Like, whoops, my pen, I'm throwing things. This control is very hard for you. Automaticity of some form is critically important. We have really good research. Ginger Berninger did a 10-year NIH study showing that speed and automaticity of output is one of the biggest predictors of the quality of your writing. And so kids who are slow and arduous handwriters need intervention. And a lot of people are inclined to say, well, just give them speech to text and have them dictate. But that's actually not writing, that's talking. And it's very hard to talk your answer to that Hamlet essay off the top of your head. It actually helps if you can make words stay still long enough to plan and rearrange them and manipulate them. And so you've got to be able to get writing onto the page quickly and automatically. That's a big open topic. I'm sure you've had lots of experts of OTs and people to speak to that on this website series. You also want to use instructional methods that are going to embed support for your executive function system. Okay, so executive functions are your ability to stay on task, to inhibit doing things that are irrelevant, to plan what you want to do, to figure out how you're going to do it, to sequence the steps, to hold ideas in your mind long enough to actually get to the end goal, and to keep yourself regulated while you're doing something. And so it's like your brain's internal air traffic control system to say, here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there, here's what we're going to do flexibly if we hit disaster. Okay, we're going to take a different route. So we just have to appreciate that the language and executive demands vary across different kinds of writing tasks. It's very different to write in your journal than it is to write about what you did on your summer vacation two months ago. And that's different than writing about what I learned about gorillas in our field trip to the zoo. And that's different than writing about a comparison of the early Jamestown settlements or F. Scott Fitzgerald and his era as reflected in The Great Gatsby, right? The demands on the brain are different with different kinds of writing. So we really have to look at what the demands are in a task that kids are engaged with. The third thing is we really have to pay attention to what kids are saying to themselves as they encounter difficulty. And self-talk, there's a lot of research on the role of self-talk or inner speech on dialogue. And we can see that if you're sitting at your desk going, I hate this, I'm never going to be able to write, I hate this teacher, I hate this class, get me out of here, can I go to the nurse? You're not going to get anywhere with your paper, right? Your self-talk is either facilitating or it's hindering. And Vygotsky, a great thinker of our time, says the role of speech is as important as the role of action in attaining a goal. And you cannot put IKEA furniture together without talking to yourself. And that talk is either helping you or it's not helping you, right? And so one of the ways that we think about that is teaching kids very explicitly how to go about the task, how to talk themselves through the process, what to say at various stages of the writing process. This is just a little bit too vague. It's on a lot of classroom posters, but it's a little bit too vague. We need to be more explicit than these grand statements like pre-writing. Well, what do you do with pre-writing? Like, what's that involved? We need to go a little bit more explicit with our instruction, because really writing is a bunch of decision-making, right? I got to write this Hamlet essay, and you got a decision after decision after decision about which direction to go. Your decisions either work out well or they don't work out well. So we've developed a method called Empower. I'm going to go through this really quickly. It was important to us that it be usable at all different grade levels, that it incorporate and is based and driven by a very explicitly taught self-talk routine, that it support kids with planning and organizing their language, that it embeds visual supports to help them with working memory and attention, and that it doesn't sound like formulaic writing that everybody writes. That method teaches the writing process in 6 explicit steps, not traditional 4. And we basically teach kids to ask yourself a question. That prompts the use of a strategy. That helps you make a decision, and that helps you move forward with the next thing. Then you ask another question. That prompts a strategy, you make a new decision, and you keep propelling yourself forward. So we're literally propelling kids forward, driven by what are you going to say to yourself and in what order. Embedded in that is really critically important is that we give kids ways to make language visible. Language is invisible. It's just, I'm just talking, the words fleeting. How do we make that visible so it stands still so we can help kids capture the complexity and the enormity of their idea? And we teach them a set of strategies that help them organize in a visual way. I'm going to get past that and mention some methods that we've developed called brain frames, which are basically just visual representations of ways we organize language. There's only 6 of them. It's pretty easy to learn. The bottom line is brains are going to do better if they're on patterns. We do everything better if there's a pattern to it. And if we can see the pattern and we can organize it, kids are thinking, they can show it. If they can see their knowledge, they can organize it. If they can organize their ideas, they can figure out how to say what they want to say. That's kind of the logic behind the methods that we've developed. I'm almost done. Land on this, which is a picture from the Common Core State Standards on writing. And it shows a bunch of writing standards on the side. Doesn't matter, you can't read them. But what I want you to pay attention to is the red bars, right? And that many of these standards are not meant to be mastered in a year. That you're working on subject, verb, and pronoun antecedent agreement in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. We expect certain aspects of writing to take a really long time for kids to be able to master and do really fluidly. And so we have to be really thoughtful about our expectations of progress, and recognize that it takes a long time for kids to be able to learn to do certain things well. So this is my final set of points. One is dysgraphia is a term that people use to describe a very broad spectrum of problems with writing that are rooted in different systems. And one of the things that I think is important is for us to really be thinking about what's the nature of the problem the kid is exhibiting, that we're describing as dysgraphia, because dysgraphia by itself is not a medical diagnosis. So we're in a conundrum there with words. Writing demands that multiple systems and processes and skills be integrated seamlessly all at the same time. That's why it's so darn hard for so many people. And when writing demands more from an individual than they have the capacity to manage, effective instruction and intervention has to target the root of the problems and accommodate the strain that those problems are putting on other aspects of the system. That's where the art of instruction really does with teachers. I would argue that effective instruction encompasses fluent transcription, graphomotor skills, handwriting, executive functions, self-talk routines, language, spatial processing, and strategies that make the invisible visible and therefore manageable. So we have a little bit of time. This is in your handout, so you know how to reach me if you have other questions and you want to chat, but ask away, Jennifer.
So lots of questions. I think at the end you got to a number of them around. So what can I do as a parent?
Yeah, what do you do?
A common theme. Like, I'm seeing these things in my children. How do I help?
Yeah, go and talk to your child's teacher and find out, what are you doing in class? Like, what is the approach that's being used? How is this being taught? Who's responsible for doing something more explicitly and systematically with my child? Because the garden variety regular instruction everybody's getting is not landing for my kid. So what's most important, the biggest question is, what's happening in the classroom? And what are the teachers seeing? And can we put our heads together and say, I'm seeing this, you're seeing this, what can be done?
That's great. And there were a couple questions, and this is one that's come up before, about what is the balance in your mind between handwriting and using accommodations for technology? Because it can help people get their thoughts out, but also how much should you be practicing handwriting, and how do you figure out that balance?
There's not like a rule. Okay, this is not a tight buttoned up thing. My bias really is, if kids are in, first of all, we have to recognize that handwriting used to be taught very differently than it is today. I don't know about all y'all, but like, I had Sister Alice Mary making me make letters over and over and over and over again. Right now, I'm blessed with reasonably fluid, and learning to handwrite was not difficult for me, and my handwriting's legible, but it was drilled and practiced very explicitly and intentionally and frequently. And so with the shift in Common Core standards and shifts in education, time in the day, as we added standardized tests into our world and the pressures of getting kids ready for the test, something had to go. And a lot of places, handwriting instruction went. So kids get a little bit of it, but they don't get enough practice to really master it. And we're not paying enough attention to how kids are holding their pencils. So, you're not going to do well if your grip is like this, because you have to move your whole arm. And by the time you have to write the Hamlet essay, if you're writing your essay with your whole arm, it's exhausting. So I would say my bias is, if kids are in the early grades, you should intervene with some kind of explicit instruction in handwriting. Get the OT on board, get somebody on board. They've done studies with a beautiful study by Jones and Christensen many years ago in England, where they took second graders and they screened everybody in their handwriting speed and automaticity and the quality of their writing. And not surprising, the kids who were slow and arduous and not very legible didn't have very good writing quality. Then they took all those kids who scored at the bottom 25%, and they gave paraprofessionals and parents came in and did 10 minutes a day with those kids every day and taught them explicitly how to form letters and get better at it. And by the end of second grade, they had not only caught up with speed and automatic, like the chart goes like this. Beginning of second grade, they're slow and their quality is not that good. By the end of second grade, they had caught up. So if you do a lot early, you can close that gap. And then not only did their speed and automaticity and legibility go up, their quality went up. They went to the same level as their peers. So my bias is, first start there. Can we move the needle with some explicit instruction? And you got to do that young, though. I had an OT on my staff who specialized in handwriting. She was a genius for many years. And her experience, she's now retired, but in her experience, you really needed to get in there and shift before kids were about 10 or 11. And so after 10 or 11, there are too many other balls for them to pay attention to. They can't focus on their handwriting and write about, the theme of the giver at the same time. It's too complex. So I would say early on, go heavy on some explicit handwriting intervention. And if you're not getting anywhere, there are some kids who are just really motorically very challenged and you're not going to move that needle. Then I would explore typing as a bypass strategy because it's so much more readily acceptable. And you have a lot more available to you to support written expression, more complex writing assignments if you can type than if you're speaking. It's not that I would never use speaking with kids, but talking and writing are vastly different. That was my dissertation research. It's not the same. Just because you can talk doesn't mean you can write. Just because you can write doesn't mean you can talk. They're really different systems.
Okay, great. I'm like skimming through because questions are pouring in now, but a lot of them are about what age is that transition and things like that. And then, strategies for, we have some teachers in the crowd too, for teachers.
Hey, teachers.
Thank you for being teachers. A lot of what can we do to help from every age. Well,
so one of my, not to be like self-promoting, but one of my companies, I provide professional development for teachers. So if you're a teacher and you want professional development, go to vivitolearning.com because there's stuff there. Okay. And it's not available for parents. Sorry, parents. We do other things for parents, but that work is specifically for teachers. And we do have some online courses and things like that teachers can avail themselves to. And I also go to schools and all over the world and do live professional development now that hopefully COVID goes away. So from a professional educator point of view, there's stuff available. And now we've got a lot more easy access with more online learning. As a parent, it is real. So I have a whole clinic full of kids with parents. And the deal is you can't be their teacher. You need to be their mom. And you need to love them and care for them and have your heart break for them and hold them up and find them help. But you can't make up for a skilled teacher and a skilled professional. And unless you are one, but that's very difficult to wear two hats, to be a mom and the person responsible for your kids' writing instruction. And some kids will accept it when they're younger, but there's a point at which they're like, no, thank you, mom. I'm on my own. And then it's a matter of finding a good coach, so I can't emphasize enough the importance of partnerships with your child's teachers. And the team that's available in your school. They know more than you do. They may not know everything, but they know stuff. They know more than you do. So.
Great. Thank you. Well, this was very much appreciated. We had a lot of positive comments, a lot of, great questions. I
wish we had 3 hours. I could talk about this forever.
I know. I think there are people who definitely would have stayed 3 hours and asked a lot of the questions. For the participants, we're going to put a super quick poll in the chat just for how much you liked the webinar and are likely to recommend future webinars. We want to let everybody know that the next webinar will be on November 22nd at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, and it's going to be representatives from COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, and they'll be talking about how to advocate for your student and when you may need a professional advocate and what you can do yourself. So a very different topic area, but very important to our audience who deals with a lot of 504s and IEPs. So we're excited about that next one. We really appreciate your time today, Dr. Singer. We will be sending out the recording of this video as well as we already posted the handout slides thank you so much. There's a couple comments that people are okay with 3 hours, they'll stay.
Next time.
We
Next
really
time.
appreciate it.
My pleasure. It really is. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for taking an hour out of your precious evening.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you to all our participants, and everyone have a great night.